It's a rematch in Texas. Dan Tom here with MMA Junkie to help you break down the main event for UFC 271 between Israel Adesanya and Robert Whittaker 2. Their first fight went down back in 2019 when Whittaker was still the champion. Whittaker actually landed some nice jabs and even some leg kicks early in that fight, but would elevate himself to a state of over-aggression and started overthrowing his shots to the point where he got hit with multiple beautiful counters in the form of check hooks from both stances from Israel Adesanya. Of course, Adesanya can fight from multiple stances. He's a very dynamic fighter, both coming forward and off the back foot. Of course, we've seen him up his strength and conditioning as of late. He's went 3-1 since his fight with Whittaker. That lone loss comes up a division to Jan Blachowicz, while Whittaker has been able to bounce back. He's went 3-0 since his fight with Adesanya, and even though Darren Till caught him with a nice short counter early, perhaps giving him PTSD flashbacks from longer fighters that can counter, perhaps Whittaker's stylistic kryptonite there, Whittaker was able to adjust, come back, win that fight, and show really nice ring generalship, some really good game planning, some sharpness, and some real discipline in his next two wins against Cannonier and Gastelum, fighting more off the back foot, really using his lead hand to check and hook off of his jab and check with his jab as well. Really key stuff I think he's going to need here. At the time of this video, Tipico Sportsbook is favoring Adesanya in the neighborhood of -290, with a comeback on your underdog Whittaker in the neighborhood of +220. Now, forget my pick and forget how wide these odds are. I believe this fight is on the table. As we've seen in this volatile sport of MMA, it's hard to replicate the same fights in the same dynamics again and again. Especially when, I would argue, when the dynamic is not quite clear, when you really have two top-tier fighters. We saw with Figueiredo and Moreno in their series thus far. We've gotten different fights each time, so I want everybody to keep that in mind. And I also want to address the wrestling. I do think it is going to be important for the Whittaker side, and I don't disagree with that. However, I do argue that it could be being a bit overblown. Let's not pretend Whittaker is Damian Maia and will insta-sub Adesanya if this hits the mat. And lest we also not forget that Adesanya, I'd argue, already had underrated takedown defense when he entered the UFC and has only since built upon that. So I don't think it's a game over dynamic, but it's definitely important for the Whittaker side. What ultimately I think is important is whichever fighter can get the other fighter to counter. I think they will have the inherent advantage in exchanges. I touched on that we could be looking at a stylistic kryptonite for Robert Whittaker in regards to technical long strikers who can counter. We saw also that with Stephen Thompson when he faced him. However, one could say the same with Adesanya. In fact, when you look at the fight with Blachowicz, everyone talks about the wrestling, but if you actually go back and look at the stats, now, stats do not tell the story of the fight, and you should not use them to score, but Jan Blachowicz did outstrike Adesanya in every round quietly, and I argue it's because he made Adesanya come to him where Blachowicz could counter. Blachowicz, like Whittaker and Adesanya, has many facets to his game, but all three of those mentioned fighters arguably do their best work when they get to counter. So, for UFC 271, whoever gets to have the countering game and dictate that part of it, I think will win. Whittaker's really going to need to really use his jab, and whether he's going with leg kicks and counters on the feet, or jabbing and looking to counter with level changes in the open, as those are his best shots to ground on Adesanya. That's going to be his best bet. I'm going to take a flyer with Whittaker here. It's not a confident call. I hate picking against Adesanya. He's smart. He's talented. He's great for the sport. I love what he has to say about mental health. But forced to make a pick, I'm going to go with Bobby Knuckles, Robert Whittaker by decision. For useful stats, gifts, and more explanation on this, go check out my in-depth breakdown at MMAJunkie.com, where you can get results this weekend.